All right, hello everyone, and good day to you wherever you are. My name is Elisa Lanzi, and I'm team leader for modeling and outlooks at the OECD's Environment Directorate. I would like to welcome you to today's OECD Green Talks Live, where we will discuss the interface of international trade and circular economy. This OECD webinar is also a World Circular Economy Forum, WCF side event. I'm sure that many of you are aware, but for those who aren't familiar, the World Circular Economy Forum is organized by Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund, and it brings together business leaders, policymakers, and experts to share the world's best circular economy solutions. In this event, we will present findings from recent work on international trade and circular economy, including two main reports, one on the consequences of a more resource-efficient and circular economy for international trade patterns, and then another report on international trade and circular economy that focuses on policy alignment. Rob DeLink and Shunta Yamaguchi from the OECD Environment Directorate, who have been leading our work on international trade and circular economy, will present some of the highlights from these reports. Before I leave the floor to Rob and Shunta, I would like to highlight that while we focus on international trade today, the OECD has published a broad range of analysis on the circular economy in close interaction with policymakers. Our modeling work in the Material Resource Outlook to 2060 shows that in absence of additional policies, materials use will double by 2060, leading to a range of environmental impacts, including damages to soil, water, and air quality, with the consequent negative impacts on human health. Furthermore, increasing materials use will also lead to more emissions of greenhouse gases, therefore aggravating the climate crisis. Additional work on circular economy at the OECD Environment Directorate has looked at plastics, as well as other important issues, such as business models for the circular economy, digitalization, and labeling. But the most relevant work stream for today is, of course, that focusing on international trade and the circular economy. This is extremely relevant as international trade plays an important role in circular supply chains in materials and products, and end-of-life value chains in waste and scrap, secondary raw materials, as well as second-hand goods. The OECD work on circular economy international trade has the ultimate purpose of encouraging the communication between key actors in the two policy fields. In fact, on the one hand, circular economy analysts often focus on circular economy, but at the national level, at times ignoring the international dimension. On the other hand, trade analysts can instead oversee the way in which the circular economy transition will affect trade. So in this context, today's webinar will focus on highlighting the importance of mutual support and coherence of trade and circular economy policies. We will try to answer some important questions, including what are the key interlinkages between circular economy and trade? What are the impacts of a resource-efficient circular economy transition on international trades? And how can we align trade and circular economy policies? The presentation by Rob and Shunta will last for about 20, maybe 30 minutes, and the talk will be followed by a Q&A session. We are really interested in getting to know your views about our findings, including what can be done to improve policies going forward. For those of you who are online today, we invite you to submit questions and remarks using the Zoom Q&A function at any point during the talk. We'll do our best to try and answer at least a few questions even during the talk. So I would like now to give the floor to Rob DeLink, who will kick off the presentation.
Thank you, Elisa, for that introduction, and good day to everybody wherever you are. So the first part of our presentation is about some modeling work that we've done to look at how international trade is affected by changes in the way we structure our economy and the shift from a more linear to a more circular economy. And this is part of a bigger project where we look at how future economic activity and materials use can be linked. So we go beyond the kind of old-fashioned way of looking at population and income as drivers of environmental pressures, but rather use a detailed description of the economy to be able to pinpoint what are the specific drivers of materials use and how these drivers then affect materials use in the way we project the economy to go forward in the coming decades. So we can then link these drivers and this associated materials use also to the different environmental impacts. For example, greenhouse gas emissions associated with energy use in the production of the materials or the processing of materials. And finally, this is one of the few models out there that is able to distinguish between raw materials, so the primary inputs that comes from mining, and recycled materials, or for example, scrap of metals. So the presentation today is based on two main reports that provide the groundwork for this trade-specific analysis, and that is baseline projections as presented in the Global Materials Outlook, Global Material Resources Outlook, sorry, to 2060, which we published in 2019, and a policy analysis that was published actually last week on the macroeconomic consequences of the transition to a circular economy. So what do we know about what's going to happen with materials use in the future? Well, it's quite clear that with economic growth and despite changes in the way we structure our economies, we will see an increase in materials use for all types of materials. We see an increase in biomass use, in fossil fuel use, in metals use, and in the use of non-metallic minerals. And this is mostly related to the fact that the scale of our economic activities grows more rapidly than the efficiency improvements that we can make to decouple materials use from the inputs. So how do we come about with this type of assessment and this type of outlook? Well, we use a large-scale modeling framework to do this based on a global assessment with 25 regions and a time horizon of 2060. So we make annual projections for the coming 40 to 50 years, looking at what happens to the economy, what are the main drivers of economic growth, and then link that to the materials use. We have more than 50 sectors in the model, and we distinguish 60 different materials. So the way it works is that we have this big modeling tool, and it's an orange box, it's not a black box, but it brings together the different economic activities using a number of assumptions on specific drivers, on demographics, for example, aging societies, on labor productivity, capital accumulation, total factor productivity, but also on structural change, the idea that industry is using more and more services as input for their production process, and households change their demand because they have a higher income, for example, and assumptions on materials extraction and recycling. And we plug that all into this economic model in which we have countries and sectors interacting with each other. So if we have an effect on one sector in one specific country, that then spills over to other sectors and other countries. And we see that all these different sectors and countries are all connected to each other. And from that, we then derive detailed economic projections, detailed projections for trade patterns, and detailed projections for the materials use. And those can then be linked to the environmental impacts. But today, I'm not going to focus so much on the environmental impacts, but more on the trade projections that are linked to these materials use drivers. So first of all, in the absence of new policies, we see that there's going to be no significant change in the share of the different materials sectors in the economy. If we look at aluminium on the left, it currently has a share of roughly 1.1% in the economy, and we project it to stay roughly stable and goes to 1.2%. Now, there is some technological development, so the growth in the total volume of outputs is not as fast as the growth in GDP, but still we see a doubling of materials use. And we see this basically for all the materials related sectors. Very much on the right, you see the recycling products, which is currently a very small sector, less than 0.1% of total trade. And even though it is growing more rapidly in our baseline projections, so with current policies already, we see recycling products growing more rapidly than the other sectors, but still it remains a very small sector. So our economy is still very much a linear economy where we mine materials, we use them in the economy, and then we consume and discard them. So what can we do to reduce this? Well, we've investigated a policy package that we call a material tax reform, which includes a tax on primary materials, raw materials, a subsidy on recycling and recycled materials, and a labor tax reduction from the revenues that we get from the tax on the raw materials. And that way we can reduce materials use throughout the economy, and we get three main effects. First effect is what we call the scale effect, and that's basically we're substituting away in the economy away from the raw materials towards other commodities in the economy because the raw materials become more expensive. So that's the dark blue part. Then the second part is an efficiency effect. As the policies make the production of raw materials more expensive, firms have an incentive to figure out a more efficient way of dealing with resources, switching to other inputs, etc., and thereby reducing the materials use related to the processed commodities that we consume. But finally, the third part is the interesting part for today, and that is there is also a big trade effect. And the idea here is that we can reduce materials use globally by sourcing materials from sectors and regions where they are produced more efficiently. And second of all, we can change our trade patterns to shift away from the materials used commodities. So what happens then at the sectoral level is that we, not surprisingly, see a reduction in the output of primary materials and an increase in recycling. But not the same happens necessarily for exports. So trade patterns, trade values of the materials themselves do not necessarily decrease. For example, for aluminium and iron and steel, we see an increase in total trade volumes. Now that's a combination of reduced share of raw aluminium products and an increased share of recycled aluminium. But it's also an idea that you get a specialization, a global specialization towards production in those regions that produce more efficiently, and therefore other regions decide to import more from those regions and reduce their domestic production because the domestic production costs have increased more. So what happens at the regional level, we can distinguish here between three different effects. First is if you implement a policy package like this, and if you discard the monetary benefits from the environmental benefits, so this, which is what we couldn't incorporate in the model, we have an effect that the tax on the raw materials pushes the economy away from using these raw materials, and that leads to a small macroeconomic cost. And so therefore the dark blue is a domestic policy effect. Basically, it is the effect that your total economic activity declines a bit if you implement this policy package. It leads, of course, to environmental benefits, but that's not included, as I said. But on the other hand, there's an international policy effect. So that's the idea that if others implement this policy, you can actually benefit from it, because if others implement the policy, their production costs increase, and you have an increase in your competitive position vis-a-vis your competitors, plus the idea that you can import more cheaply from those countries that have a significant effect on the labor tax reduction. So if you're importing a lot of labor-intensive products and labor becomes cheaper, then you can import more cheaply. And finally, there's an interaction effect, because the domestic effect and the international effect are working together and consumers and firms then maximize to both these shocks at the same time and try to optimize their behavior, and therefore the GDP loss is slightly smaller. Then what happens to the materials commodity. So this includes both the primary materials and the secondary materials, because we distinguish between primary and secondary materials in the way they are produced, but actually the processed metals, etc., that come out are the same. So that's why in the trade volumes, we include both primary and secondary. So for the exports, we see again that there's this shift between sectors. Some countries see a reduction in exports, some other countries see an increase in exports. And that's where you see the concentration of production going on. And this is driven by regional differences, not only in endowments, but also the fact whether they are materials importers or exporters, the way the domestic economy is diversified and can absorb the different shocks and the different policies, etc. The effects on imports is more equal across the different sectors, across the different regions, and reflects mostly that you're able to import a little bit more in order to reduce your domestic raw material use. So what does this mean in total? From the modeling work, we find that for the baseline trends that we foresee for the coming decades, we foresee a big role for trade in the way our economies evolve. This is done before the COVID crisis, so these projections do not include the effects of the COVID pandemic on trade and on GDP, but it's clear that there is at least a short-term reduction in 2020 and 2021 from the COVID pandemic. But we see that there's no big shift. There are trends that shift the economy towards more services, etc. But there's no big shift away from materials using commodities and producing in a linear fashion because the policy incentives are just not there. And secondly, we see that there's a big shift away from trade from the OECD and to the OECD to more trade between emerging economies and between emerging economies and developing economies. And looking at the policy reforms, or the transition to a circular economy, you would think that primarily the effect is on the trade, is on the materials-related commodities, and that is true, but they have spillover effects on the rest of the economy. And even in a uniform global implementation of a policy package, as I just outlined above, you still get shifts between sectors, get shifts between regions, and that means that the regional differences imply a shift in competitive position. So the impacts come from a mix of domestic and international effects, and trade effects on materials use are very significant, especially in non-ferrous metals, where you have differences in regional production costs. And with that, I think I can hand over to Shunta for the second part of the presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rob. And I'd like to dive into this second report on international trade and circular economy policy alignment, which we released last month. I'll dive directly into the contents. So first, in this report, we look at the interlinkages between trade and circular economy. And we have a diagram here showing a linear economy where we produce, consume, and dispose products when they reach end of life. And the circular economy transition really tries to close, narrow, and extend these material loops in various ways. The easiest to understand is probably recycling. There are other ways, such as higher value loops, such as refurbishment and manufacturing, reuse and repair. There can also be efforts upstream, such as eco-design policies that extend material loops. And finally, there are product service systems that extend a product life cycle as well, such as car sharing services that are also part of the circular economy concept. Now, a lot of these policies and initiatives happen within domestic boundaries, but they have important linkages with international trade, and in three main ways. The first one is through global supply chains, as our economies are interlinked. The second is through end-of-life value chains, such as trade in second-hand goods, trade in goods for refurbishment and manufacturing, trade in waste for recovery, and trade in secondary raw materials. A third pillar is the opportunities for trade in services, as the circular economy transition has a high involvement of the services sectors. Now, these trade flows have different pressure points and interactions with trade and circular economy. The first one is on the how the circular economy transition has an impact on trade, and that's exactly what Rob has illustrated in his study as shared early on. The second one is the necessary policy alignment between these two areas, and I'll be talking about in my slides. And then there are other related areas, such as understanding the nature of trade in waste and secondary materials or secondhand goods, and identifying the role of international cooperation, which I'll also be talking about in my slides as well. Next slide, please. Well, just to highlight why supply chains are important as part of the circular economy transition, here on the left-hand panel, we see OECD countries, and we see that GDP has grown by around 220% across the past 30 years. However, when you focus on domestic material consumption, this has remained relatively flat in the bottom side of the left-hand panel. So one can argue that there's absolute decoupling happening in OECD countries. However, when you focus on a material footprint on the right hand of the panel, which represents the domestic final use of products in terms of raw material equivalents, the amount of materials that are needed in OECD countries nearly increased by 67%. And this really tells a story that when you're thinking of a transition to a more resource efficient and circular economy, you really need to think about ensuring environmentally sustainable supply chains as well. Next slide, please. And I'd also like to touch upon waste trade, and this is an illustration of waste trade in plastics across the last 30 years and across the last 3 years. And we see that the fractions that used to be traded to China, the blue and the orange shaded area, has drastically reduced. They came down by 99% with the introduction of import bans in China. And this has two implications. So the fractions that used to be destined to China are either, they're not going anywhere. So this provokes increased domestic incineration, landfilling, or even stockpiling. And we really need to keep an eye on how these are managed domestically. The other implication is that the fractions that used to be traded to China are looking for other outlets. And this also risks that these waste streams are being diverted to other countries with weak treatment standards and needs a lot of attention. This also is very important with the introduction of the Basel Amendments on plastic waste trade. So then we focus on the two policy areas on trade and circular economy. And the starting point really is that trade policies are not often familiar to environmental policymakers, and circular economy policies are not familiar to trade officials. So the aim is really to try to fill in this gap. And the trade policies that we looked at are rather the basic ones at the multilateral level on non-discrimination, general exceptions, technical barriers to trade, and transparency, consultation, and capacity building commitments. And especially this third point on technical barriers to trade, the TBT Agreement aims to facilitate trade and harmonize technical regulations as widely as possible and encourages members to adopt international standards for policy making. This is to cut down on the compliance costs, not to excessively have a burden on economic actors that are operating at the global level. Second, on the regional trade agreements, we see several developments, and there are specific provisions on circular economy found in 5 draft agreements so far. There are also circular economy related provisions found more broadly, such as on natural resources or waste management, references to the Basel Convention, or there are specific provisions on food waste that are found in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. Next slide, please. Then we have turned to what are we exactly talking about when we focus on circular economy policies and initiatives. And I'd like to show an OECD survey of 2017. The left-hand panel shows the policies that are in place so far. The right-hand panel shows the policies that are either planned or under consideration. And here we see that if we cluster them in 6 broad categories, so the first category is on extended producer responsibility and product stewardship schemes. The second one is around taxes and subsidies. The third category is around eco-design. Fourth one on green government procurement, 5th one around eco-labeling, and 6th one around circular economy related standards. And with these 6 broad categories, we see that there's a fair amount of coverage in terms of the circular economy and resource efficiency policies that are either implemented or under consideration. There are other policies such as education campaigns, public research and development, or material extraction, material exchange platforms, and these are all relevant for a circular economy transition. However, they appear possibly less relevant for trade and not covered in this report. Now, next slide, turning to more details on related standards on the circular economy, which have implications to the TBT agreement. There are various developments in this area. So on the standards on the organization and management of the circular economy are already available in UK and France and ongoing under the ISO. There are also standards around recycling facilities, and more importantly, standards around product-related standards for the circular economy, such as material content, recyclability and repairability, sustainable production, material quality, and product quality. And these are very important. For instance, extended producer responsibility schemes moving towards modulated recycling fees, or policies around eco-labeling or government procurement will turn to some kind of available standards. And since these standards do have a trade effect, we need to keep a close eye on these developments as well. Next slide, please. So then we look into how these two policy areas could be made mutually supportive. And we tried to unpack this in two ways. So first one is to focus on the domestic policies. What can governments do within their domestic policy space? And then going further on, what can't be done within your domestic policy space, and you need some kind of international cooperation. So the left-hand pillar is on the circular economy policies, and the second pillar is on potential actions. Starting from the very top, circular economy policies in general should be designed and implemented in a non-discriminatory fashion, and they need to be notified in a timely manner if they have significant trade effects. And then on more specifically on extended producer responsibility and product stewardship schemes, we really need to re-examine how these schemes account for end-of-life value chains. And this is because some schemes appear to incentivize waste trade by allowing exporters to claim that waste exports are 100% recycled without accounting for intermediate processing losses. So we really need a better understanding of the waste shipments abroad and to secure the environmentally sound management at destination. There could also be domestic efforts to tackle illegal waste trade and also tackle potential free riding on cross-border online sales. And then further on the next slide, we turn to circular economy related standards, and efforts at the national level are encouraged to align with international standards wherever appropriate, and also to notify these regulations and standards in accordance with the WTO agreements. And finally, on trade flows, this is not specifically tied to any kind of circular economy policy per se, but they nevertheless have important implications. And governments can revisit national definitions of waste and other end-of-life value chains to facilitate trade that could contribute to the circular economy and distinguishing them from unwanted fractions. Now, turning on to the international approaches, from the very top, extended producer responsibility and product stewardship schemes can coordinate efforts to tackle free riding from online sales. More importantly, around circular economy related standards, efforts can be made for harmonization of these standards or placing efforts toward mutual recognition of conformity assessment procedures. Also, parties interested could be engaged in the development of international standards, such as that appear critical for the circular economy, such as material quality of secondary raw materials and on sustainable production. On trade flows, again, interested parties could place efforts to clarify different definitions and classifications of waste and end-of-life value chains across these jurisdictions and how these relate to HS codes, the trade codes in place. And they can also place efforts to secure better data. And these kind of dialogues can take place at the international level, for instance, at the WTO or the World Customs Organization, the Basel Convention, or the OECD. And there are also regional dialogues that parties can turn to, such as the frameworks of regional trade agreements. Next slide, please. So as a summary of this analysis, and also through stakeholder consultations, see that trade can contribute to a circular economy via economies of scales for materials to be better used. And therefore, trade impediments for a circular economy business models needs to be addressed. But at the same time, trade leading to negative environmental consequences really need to be avoided. And striking the right balance here is really what we're talking about. And then on supply chains, securing an environmentally sustainable just transition for the extractive sector is vital. For opportunities on end-of-life value chains are mixed. Some promising areas that appear to be on secondary raw materials and trade in refurbishment and manufactured goods. Other areas appear challenging, such as trade in waste and scrap and secondhand goods because of potential trade-off between environmental protection and economic efficiency. And then trade in services also appear critical for circular business models because they require movement of people, information, and data. And these should be reflected in any efforts in liberalizing services trade in this area. Finally, in order for trade to work for the circular economy, we really need better transparency and traceability of value chains. And these can be explored by better definitions and classifications, standards, regulations, and exploring possible avenues through trade facilitation mechanisms and through innovation. Then next slide, please. So final remarks and future directions. As a summary, we understand that trade has important linkages with circular economy, and trade and circular economy policies need to be coherent and mutually supportive. In terms of future directions for work, at least at the OECD, we are working towards securing resilient value chains for the circular economy, exploring the role of standards, trade facilitation mechanisms, and innovation. We're also turning to in-depth analysis of specific trade flows. We're working on the global plastics outlook, and also our colleagues at the Trade and Agriculture Directorate are focusing on e-waste. We're also developing strands of work on around recent developments with implications for trade, such as COVID implications and reshoring effects. So that's all from my side, and looking forward to the discussions today.
Thank you very much, Rob and Shunta, for a very interesting presentation. We will now move on to the Q&A. You can submit questions and remarks using the Zoom Q&A function. This is your chance to dig deeper into the subject. We already have a number of questions that have come through. So I'd like to ask a question that I think both speakers can provide insights on, and specifically focus on developing countries. So the question is, what are the implications of trade and circular economy in the context of developing countries? What are the opportunities and challenges that would emerge from a transition towards a resource efficient and circular economy? And what would be the role for trade for developing countries? Who'd like to go first?
Okay, I'll go first. And thank you, Elisa, for raising this very important question. I'll be very brief and like to maybe raise 2 points. So the first point is that development countries are often suppliers of raw materials. And as we've seen from the analysis from Rob, some extractive sectors may be at risk being negatively affected by the circular economy transition. But at the same time, the demand for certain materials are bound to continue, and especially towards the transition to a circular and low carbon economy. So again, this is repeating, but we really need to secure an environmentally sustainable and just transition for the extractive sector, also keeping in mind of social aspects and labor aspects as well. The second point is that the circular economy transition can provide new opportunities in terms of accessing foreign markets of circular products, or managing materials better domestically and in a sustainable way. And for this to happen, this will require some kind of domestic capacity building efforts. And there appears to be key roles for aid for trade in this area. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, if I may, Elisa, I can add a few words here as well. So I think that the role of developing countries or in emerging economies is vital. The circular economy transition, or the change towards a more resource efficient and circular economy, needs to be global. It's not something that the OECD countries can do on their own. Shunta had a very nice slide where he showed that basically if you try to do something like resource efficiency and circular economy only within OECD countries, what will happen is that a lot of trade will shift, that we start importing the materials intensive commodities from emerging and developing countries. And we're basically just shifting environmental problems around in the world rather than resolving them. So we need a global approach. And it's, yes, there are many countries, developing countries, that rely on the export of resources, but it's part of a bigger development picture that we need to move away from that gradually and make sure that if developing countries have a role to play in a new economy that's emerging, that's more related towards services, that can leapfrog some of the industrial developments that OECD countries have taken their time to do. And this is vital that OECD countries support, of course, in this direction, and make sure that the same mistakes that we were making in the past are avoided by other countries.
All right, thanks very much. I'd like now to raise another question that is very important in the context of international trade and circular economy, and that's the issue of waste trade. So waste trade can increase environmental pressure at destination and cause a lot of problems. And there have been many developments in the international level, including, the Basel Convention amendments to plastic waste, revisions to the OECD decision on the transboundary movement of waste, and the Chinese import bans on a selection of solid waste trades. So in that context, what do you think are additional steps that needs to be taken in your view?
Yes, so let me go. Thank you for raising this very important question on waste trade. And this is a very complicated issue, especially because waste trade tends to occur between countries that have different environmental policy stringency levels. And often the environmental impact is generally shifted to the recipient end. However, when we look at how trade can contribute to the circular economy, we really want to keep in mind that we want to have a clearer distinction on the trade that would support the circular economy and trade that would hinder the circular economy transition. And in this view, I think the world right now is really, there are a lot of developments around and placing more controls in waste trade. For instance, we see that in the Basel Amendments or the import bans by China on plastic waste and other solid waste. But there also is a focus on, there could be focus on the fractions we do want to facilitate for the circular economy transition. And for this, the prior informed consent procedures, so having a pre-agreement between the two countries to allow certain fractions of trade to happen, can have important safeguards. But when you also talk to the private sector, they say that these procedures take longer time than anticipated. So we really need to ensure that these processes work in a very swift way so that they can support businesses in this direction. Another aspect is tackling illegal waste trade. And this will help facilitate legitimate trade. So better domestic enforcement and international cooperation in this field is essential in my view.
Shouldn't I actually have, oh, sorry, Rob, did you want to add something?
You're the boss, so can I add something or do you want to
follow up
with Shunta first? So I just wanted to say that basically trade in waste is not something that is inherently bad or inherently good. There's always pros and cons. And in this case, I think what is vital is that we understand what happens with the waste flows in the destination country. And very often we just don't have the information to know whether it's treated properly or not. In principle, it makes sense that all commodities, including waste, are traded at some scale, but not if we don't understand what's going to happen with them. Because if you think about it in relation to, for example, extended producer responsibility, when you lose track of what happens at the end of the life cycle, you kind of lose track of what happens in total with the materials that you use in your economy. So you need better information and then figure out which parts of the waste trade is bad for the environment, is bad for sustainable development, and which parts could be allowed because they're basically exploiting an economic efficiency.
Well, I'll carry on with the question that I think is more directed to you then, and linked to actually the discussion of COVID-19 pandemic. For instance, do you think that COVID will change anything for waste or more in general for the resource efficient and circular economy transition? Can, for instance, recovery packages that governments are currently working on help to make a better transition or a quicker transition towards a circular economy?
That's a very good question. But it's too early to answer these questions. We don't know yet what the full impacts of the COVID pandemic on our economies are. We have done some work at the OECD. We're planning to publish that in the coming weeks as part of the COVID hub of the OECD, on looking at how the implications are of the COVID on economic activity and how that affects environmental pressures. But we couldn't dare include anything on the recovery packages that the governments are discussing because a lot of them are not clear enough. The early signs are that in terms of rhetoric, it's very optimistic in the sense of green deals and in the sense of trying to go for recovery packages that indeed facilitate the transition to a circular economy. But when you look at what governments actually implemented in 2020, in the first round when this pandemic came up and governments responded, their first response was actually mostly to support the status quo and to also support those sectors that are not really benefiting from the transition to a circular economy. So we do need much more work on figuring out how these recovery packages look like and how we can frame them in such a way that they do facilitate the transition to a circular economy, also in connection with a low carbon transition.
All right, thank you. All right, we just received a question on one of my favorite topics, that is innovation. And the question is probably to both of you, asking on whether you think that technological change would be in favor to resource efficiency, in terms that it could help to reduce externalities and improve the circular economy in a faster way. It could also advantage those countries that provide incentive towards innovation. So in that respect, do you think it would be better also to have incentives for taxes, or how do you think you could stimulate innovation in this context? Whoever wants to start.
Yeah, let me go first, and maybe Rob wants to add on. So I think for trade to work for the circular economy, we really need better transparency and traceability. And digital technologies and innovation can be potential avenues to go forward in this direction. And there are probably maybe two emerging developments in this field. So first is to have better tracking of information upstream in production. So how products are made, how sustainable they are, what they include. And this is sort of emerging in the form of digital product passports or blockchain technology. And I think this could have an important role to play. And there are also initiatives around more downstream on tracking hazardous waste. And we already see that some governments are trying to use digital tools to track these fractions. But these are very much at the early stage. And I think we really need more work to understand how these technologies could support policies for the circular economy transition, and vice versa, how policies can foster these kinds of innovations. So we really need more work in this direction.
Rob?
Yeah, I fully agree. So for me, there are two major effects here. One is that getting the prices right is a vital first step towards incentivizing innovation and incentivizing green design, etc. One of the slides that I showed that highlighted the big role of trade also highlighted the big role for productivity improvements and efficiency improvements as a part of the solution to reduce materials use and make the transition to a resource efficient circular economy. So you need to get the prices right. We need to start taxing the things that cause environmental problems, and we need to stop taxing the things that contribute to the circular economy transition, or at least tax them lower. But that generally, as the literature finds, is not enough to stimulate innovation, because the benefits of innovation are often a public good. Everybody benefits from a better design, but the cost of the innovation are often borne privately. So therefore, we do need government support to innovation in order to facilitate this transition. And governments need to also facilitate that innovators can actually make the right innovations by providing coherent policy signals that are long-term. So that's the firms that want to innovate know what's coming up in the coming decades, and they can innovate towards those policy goals.
All right, thanks. Well, we just received a question that I think will make Shunta happy. The question concerns the opportunities and challenges for regional trade agreements and free trade agreements in the context of supporting the transition to a circular economy. Yeah, so the question is, since it takes a long time to negotiate comprehensive agreements, do you think it's more likely than that major economies will take unilateral action instead of counting on international agreements?
This is, I think, an excellent question. And I think it really boils down to, are you able to solve any issues around trade and circular economy by taking unilateral action, or do you need to cooperate with other partners? And at least to me, when I'm working on this report, I clearly see that there are a lot of elements that you would need some kind of international cooperation. And one avenue to go forward with this would be regional trade agreements. So despite that regional trade agreements would take some time to negotiate, I think it shows the commitments between the parties, and they really provide interesting opportunities. I think maybe there are three broad ways of how regional trade agreements could foster the circular economy transition. The first one is around trade in environmental goods that could contribute to the circular economy, so facilitating goods that for recycling and waste management, or trade in secondary raw materials. The second point is on the different definitions and classifications of waste and end-of-life value chains, and parties might want to discuss that. The third one is possible ways to harmonize different circular economy standards, or putting efforts for mutual acceptance of conformity assessment procedures. And this would really depend on how these parties would put in place their commitments, as well as how they would implement these commitments. And since the circular economy related provisions are just starting to mushroom, I think we will see further efforts likely emerging as we go forward. Thanks,
Shunta. On a slight change of topic, we can maybe go back to modeling. I'll use that since I'm a modeler myself to discuss the Interlinkages model a bit more. One question we received is on the policy package that we set it up basically on taxation on primary and secondary materials, instead of taxing directly the externalities that are caused by the use of materials. So the question is, wouldn't it be better to tax directly the externalities such as pollution within the policy packages? I think that's a question for Rob.
Okay. Excellent question. And yes, a government should probably tax the externalities rather than the vehicle with which they interact with the economy. The problem we had in our modeling, why we didn't include taxation on the basis of pollution levels, is that in order to come up with taxes that are directly related to pollution, you need to do a life cycle analysis of the environmental implications of extraction, processing, consumption phase, discarding, the waste, etc. And you need to come up with a full life cycle assessment of the environmental implications of primary and secondary, so the raw materials as well as the recycled materials. Now we know that the recycling steps are less polluting than the primary materials used and then the extraction phase on average. But what we do not know is how big the differences are between the different sectors in the different countries. So we don't have enough data, at least not in our modeling analysis, we don't have enough robust data to be able to say that certain sectors in specific countries pollute this much or pollute that much. So we couldn't just tax these pollution levels, but rather what we did is we put a tax on the materials use, which we know is associated with the pollution, and then calculated a global average of the effects of this on pollution levels. But it doesn't mean that policy should be as simplified as our modeling. The policy indeed should focus on taxing externalities where possible. So the moment that policymakers are able to establish pollution coefficients that are robust, then of course those should be preferably used to build as a basis for taxation or other policies.
All right, thanks, Rob. I'd like to go back to Shunta for a question on secondhand goods. The question being whether you think that there might be trade-offs between environmental protection and economic efficiency regarding secondhand goods.
Yes, thank you, Elisa. I also saw this excellent question being raised. And to dig a little bit deeper, so for secondhand goods to be used in entering into a second life would be better from a circular economy point of view, because products will enter a second or third life and materials will generally be better used. They will have a better life cycle. But for instance, if they are secondhand goods, sort of secondhand vehicles, for instance, these can create locking of economies into insufficient technologies, such as if you have vehicles that are very polluting, they're secondhand and very polluting, you do not want to run that within your countries, because you do have trade-offs, for instance, between circular economy and climate ambitions. So, and also for local pollution. So you would really need to have a good understanding and analysis on how to balance these two dimensions out, and to be aware of these trade-offs when handling secondhand goods. But we really don't want to have planned obsolescence. So, and in order for secondhand goods trades to work, these really need to be being designed with end-of-life management in place or in the thinking. So eco-design would be a critical aspect in this respect.
Thanks, Shunta.
Can I add one tiny remark on this? And that is that I think this is exactly, comes back to the first question that was raised about developing countries and the need for a global perspective. There's a risk that we're coming up with very stringent policies, and we're shifting towards, for example, electric vehicles in OECD countries where people can afford these, and then ship secondhand cars to other parts of the world where they lead to additional pollution. And that's something that's a real dilemma that we need to confront and find solutions for. Because on the one hand, you want long lifetimes for consumer durable goods, but on the other hand, the longer you keep an inefficient good, the longer you have the associated pollution from the use phase. So it's really about a trade-off between the pollution levels associated with the production of the durable good versus vis-a-vis the pollution associated with the use of the durable goods. And there's a big difference between the different commodities. So we really need to look at this on an individual basis.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Well, we've received a question that was specifically focused on climate change, and that's a bit beyond the scope of this talk, which is about circular economy. But nevertheless, I'd like to use that as a chance to ask about the interactions and synergies between climate and circular economy, and the nexus between climate and circular economy. So how do you think that circular economy and low carbon transition are linked, and how can policies create synergies between these two policy domains? Rob, do you maybe want to?
Yeah, I'll start with this one. It's not an easy question, but there are, of course, different elements here. One of my favorite examples is that in eco-design, you have a choice between designing for energy efficiency versus designing for repairability and recycling efforts. So in that sense, there are trade-offs between circular economy transition and the low carbon transition. Another example is the use of rare earth elements in some of the renewable energy components. So you have these trade-offs, but there are also big synergies. And the synergies, I think, are mostly in the sense of doing a major transformation. And now we have the opportunity with the recovery packages that governments are contemplating in response to the COVID pandemic. We have this opportunity to do massive investments in building back greener, building back better. And this building back greener and better, the most efficient way to do that is to immediately build for a future that is not only low carbon, but also more circular and resource efficient. In other words, you need to have these transitions, and it's much cheaper to have these transitions simultaneously than to have two individual transitions that you're trying to manage separately with disregarding all the interactions between them. It's not a full answer, but I would think that we need a full seminar on this topic if we really wanted to dive into it. So.
Absolutely. I know it's being late, but if you can maybe give a 1 minute answer, we just got a very interesting question, which is one issue is, of course, countries that heavily rely on raw materials. So the issue is, how do we get these countries to also support the transition to a circular economy when it's going to be harder for them to achieve it?
In 1 minute.
Yes, please.
And Shinta can go first.
Me first. Well, I really think, drawing on Rob's presentation, it really shows that with the drive of circular economy in the world, there will be a more specialization. So countries that react earlier or to put in the circular economy thinking in their extractive sectors as well will eventually be better off, in my view. So I think the analysis really shows that these countries that are maybe not as engaged could really think that the circular economy is part of their policy domain as well.
No, exactly. I think countries that just continue to rely on exporting raw materials, fossil fuels, and do not look forward, they're going to have a problem because the world is moving forward. So it's just simply not a viable option to just think that the world will not change, because the world is changing and the world is moving towards a low carbon, more circular economy. But there are ways for exporters of raw materials to also increase if they are indeed moving quickly. I'm from the Netherlands, and one of my favorite examples is that there's a big discussion right now on agriculture in the Netherlands, because the Netherlands is a very big exporter of agricultural commodities, and they have seen this circular economy transition coming up, and there's a big policy debate on how can we make the agricultural sector in the Netherlands more circular, so that in a future world that is more resource efficient and circular, that we can still have an export market for Dutch agricultural commodities. I'm not saying that that's a perfect strategy. I'm not saying that the challenges are not different in developing countries, for example. But what I'm saying is starting to think about it now and preparing for changes that will come regardless of whether you want them is vital.
Thank you. So we have, just for information, a couple of questions on plastics. We won't have enough time to address those, but I'd like to suggest to stay tuned because we're doing more and more work on plastics. So we'll hopefully have more interesting results coming in the next year or so. Otherwise, we're getting to the end of our talk, and I hope that the insights provided by Rob and Shunta helped understanding the importance of considering the interactions between circular economy and international trades. I'd like to thank our speakers, Rob and Shunta, and I'd like to thank you all for having joined today's OECD Green Talks live webinar and for contributing to the discussion. We look forward to seeing you at our future talks. You can find the link in our website at the end of the Zoom chat stream, where you will be able to find also the replay and stay informed about upcoming talks. You can also find links to our work on the Recircle project webpage, as well as on our webpage on trade, resource efficiency, and the circular economy. All of this information has been added to the chat box. So with that, I'd like to thank you all very much again for your attention and wish you a lovely rest of the day. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.